Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Café Muse's 2023 Annual DC Area Literary Translators Program. That's DC Alt for short. Thank you to Michael Davis for sharing your classical guitar with us, and to Dan Marino for the lovely photographs assembled into a slideshow by Henry Crawford. I'm Luther Jett. I will be co-hosting this evening along with Barbara Goldberg. In a few minutes, Barbara will introduce our featured poet translators, Kareem James Abu Zaid, translating from the Palestinian poet Najwan Darwish, and Roger Sedarat, translating ghazals from the Persian poet Hafiz. We've left enough time in our 1-hour program for Barbara to lead a brief Q&A after their readings. And there are a few items to mention before I turn this over to Barbara. During the reading, you can use the chat feature to make comments or ask questions for the poets to answer during the Q&A. We don't always get to all the questions. We always do hope that we have more questions than we can get to. We've muted your microphones so that if your dog starts to bark, your baby starts to cry, or the doorbell rings, it won't interrupt our program. So bear with us if we do encounter a technical glitch. We'll do everything we can to come right back. If you're having difficulty hearing the poets, or hearing me for that matter, you can use Zoom's closed caption feature. To use it, look for a gray box at the bottom of your screen labeled CC. Click it, choose Show Subtitles, and closed captions will appear at the bottom of your screen. We also encourage you to buy our poets' books. We'll be putting a link in the chat that will send you to a site through which you can do just that. Café Muse is a nonprofit organization with an all-volunteer team. We also encourage you to donate to Café Muse in support of its various literary programs, and we'll put a donation link in the chat also. Now, Barbara Goldberg, poet and translator, is the author of 8 books, including her most recent, Breaking and Entering New and Selected Poems. She is also the translation editor for the WordWorks International Editions. So please welcome Barbara Goldberg.
Hi, everyone. I see so many familiar faces. That's great. So let me start with a question. I'm assuming that most of the people here are either fiction writers or poets or some kind of writer. Am I right on that? No? Oh, well. Because I'm assuming that others, if they're not writers or civilians, are read fiction at least. And I've always found that in reading fiction, the greatest thrill is like when you fall into a character and you get into the mindset and you're so curious about what happens and what actions he or she takes. And I think a translation is a lot like that, meaning it's a pleasure because you fall into the artist's mind and you begin to keep him company or her. And it doesn't matter if they're living or dead. And you get conversations going, you argue, you say, well, why'd you do that, you stupid thing, or whatever. And it's really a live interchange. And it's like inhaling another world or going on a trip, traveling. And, there's an article in Poetry this month. I hope you all read it. It's about from the point of view of a translator who got the whole work translated except for one line. I've had that experience. And that one line, just didn't get resolved like for months. So the point is a translator has to have an obsessive mind and enjoy that kind of obsession, because otherwise you're in for a long haul. So I just want to introduce our very first reader, who's going to be Kareem James Abu Zaid. And tonight he'll read from the Palestinian poet Najm Darwish's Exhausted on the Cross. And Darwish writes, we drag histories behind us, here where there's neither land nor sky. His poetry is driven by moral imperative to be, quote, a colossal record of violence, and at the same time, the no less colossal record of compassion. I hope one of the questions for Kareem at the end is going to be something about the relationship between translation and empathy. I do want to mention that Kareem was born in Egypt, grew up in Kuwait, and then came to, well, I know you live now in Santa Fe. So anyway, I hope you enjoy his reading.
Thanks so much, Barbara. And thanks everyone for coming. I want to say first, you may hear my 7-year-old stepson in the background. You may also hear some rain. It just started pouring here and it's paused now, but it's very welcome out here in Santa Fe. So I'm actually going to read from a couple different collections. I wanted to read just a couple poems by another Palestinian poet. She's a Palestinian diaspora poet named Olivia Elias, just because it was my most recent book of translations to come out. And the book is called Chaos Crossing by Olivia Elias. She writes in French. She started writing quite late in life. She was born in 1948. And she grew up, well, she was born in Palestine, exiled to, actually, she was born in 1944, exiled in 1948 with her family to Beirut, lost her Arabic, learned French, wound up in first in Canada, and then eventually in France, where she lives today. So I'm just going to read a couple poems from this book, and then we'll read from Najm Darwish. So this is Olivia Elias, and the book again is called Chaos Crossing. Came out last year with World Poetry Books. And as you'll see, a lot of these poems are about migration, exile, and these kind of things. And certainly the three that I am going to read are about that. The first one is called Call. 18 years old, the sea for horizon. For so long dreaming of unfurling his foliage, taking stock of his steps. And just as the earth cannot contain the sap each spring, the call keeps growing. 18 years old, the sea for horizon. Finally, to obey the command, roll the dice and cross the liquid wall. And Barbara, can you hear me over the rain?
I sure can.
Okay, good. Just making sure it's quite loud here. All right. The second poem I'm going to read is called Barca Nostra, 19 December 2019. The title is a reference to a fairly controversial piece of art that was in the Venice Biennale a few years ago, which was the salvaged wreckage of a ship that had sunk, that was transporting migrants across the Mediterranean, and almost everyone on board passed away. And so this is called Barca Nostra. Their report cards pinned to their chests will not have saved them. Pathetic passports, barely good enough for paper balls. Loaded dice, error message, this world is not their home. The white border closed to the children of the rusty trawler. The words are absent, only want to pray and bow down before the fallen children in the field of the honor of the struggle for a good life. Their report cards pinned to their chests, posthumous decorations, night after night in the Mediterranean Sea, in the middle of a tablecloth of paper funeral flowers, a boat wanders off course and sinks. This world is not their home. Forever closed, the white border. And one more poem by Olivia Elias from Chaos Crossing. This one is called Our bags are always ready. She was born in Haifa, by the way, in Palestine, I should say. It gets mentioned here. Our bags are always ready. We who know exile, our bags are always ready. Depart, depart, and it's only in our village that we're finally at home. From very ancient memory, I know this land, this warmth, this moisture. I felt them in my mother's womb, and when I opened my eyes for the very first time, there was the blue of her eyes, and all around the deep blue of the Haifa sky. A blue like the sky of Beirut, before all the concrete and pollution, so blue I used to dive into it before falling asleep in the frozen white night of this great American city they call Montreal, which turns its back on its own river to better forget the exile. Blue and still more blue, I felt this warmth in my mother's womb, and there was the scent of jasmine, rife in all the gardens of Damascus. There were the pomegranates, the figs, the green gages, and all the fruits of paradise. So that's Olivia Elias again, a Palestinian diaspora poet who writes in French. And again, the book is called Chaos Crossing. And I just wanted to give you a taste of her poetry, since that was the last book that I translated. We're going to move on to Najwan Darwish. He's a contemporary Palestinian poet born in 1978. I've translated 2 books by him. They both came out with NYRB Poets. The first one, Nothing More to Lose, came out in 2014. And the most recent one, Exhausted on the Cross, came out in 2021. He was actually the first poet to have 2 books in that series. I'm going to read a smattering of poems by him, mostly in English. I'll read the very last one in both languages, in Arabic and English. I'm going to read first 2 of the earlier ones, 2 of my favorites from the first book. The first one is called Sleeping in Gaza. Again, the book is Nothing More to Lose. And there's a name in here, fado, which is the Portuguese word for fate, and also has musical resonances. And this was written it was written December 2008 during one of the Israeli air raids in Gaza at that time. Sleeping in Gaza. Fado, I'll sleep like people do when shells are falling and the sky is torn like living flesh. I'll dream then like people do when shells are falling. I'll dream of betrayals. I'll wake at noon and ask the radio the questions people ask of it. Is the shelling over? How many were killed? But my tragedy, Fado, is that there are 2 types of people, those who cast their suffering and sins into the streets so they can sleep, and those who collect the people's suffering and sins, mold them into crosses, and parade them through the streets of Babylon and Gaza and Beirut, all the while crying, are there any more to come? Are there any more to come? 2 years ago, I walked through the streets of Dahia in southern Beirut and dragged a cross as large as the wrecked buildings. But who today will lift a cross from the back of a weary man in Jerusalem? The earth is 3 nails, and mercy a hammer. Strike, Lord, strike with the plains. Are there any more to come? Next poem is called Phobia. I feel like I should read a slightly lighter one after that one. And the title in Arabic is also Phobia. Phobia. This one was a lot of fun to translate, actually. I'll be banished from the city before night falls. They'll claim I neglected to pay for the air. I'll be banished from the city before the advent of evening. They'll claim I paid no rent for the sun, nor any fees for the clouds. I'll be banished from the city before the sun rises. They'll say I gave night grief and failed to lift my praises to the stars. I'll be banished from the city before I've even left the womb, because all I did for 7 months was write poems and wait to be. I'll be banished from being because I'm partial to the void. I'll be banished from the void for my suspect ties to being. I'll be banished from both being and the void because I was born of becoming. I'll be banished. So those first two were from Najwan's first book in English, and I'm going to read a couple now from the book I think you have in the chat, which is Exhausted on the Cross. And this book, it won the Sarah Maguire Prize for Poetry and Translation in 2022 and was a finalist for the National Translation Award and the PEN America Prize in Translation, and also the Derek Walcott Prize for Poetry. And I'll start with the first poem from the book. It's called Mount Carmel. And Mount Carmel is the mountain that dominates Haifa. And I should say that Najwan Darwish lives sort of between Jerusalem and Haifa. There is two of his muses. Mount Carmel. Though you're right beside it, you can't call out to the sea, neighbor, come join me for a coffee. Instead, and without my permission, my other neighbor, Carmel, visits me through the window, never trying to enter by the door. It owns the place, at any rate. Sometimes the church bells reach me from the depths of Wadi Nisnas, and some mornings the call to prayer comes in quietly from the Istiklal Mosque, born on an ancient breeze from Wadi Salib. And the Baha'is keep giving alms and filling the city with Persian gardens that escaped from Shiraz. And in Kababir, the followers of Mirza Ghulam Ahmed maintain their naps of devotion and hunt for truth in the Prophet's words. As for the holy men among the Druze, their poems reach me from the temple at the foot of Mount Hermon, like the white headscarves of their women, the ones that hide 1,000 years of darkness. And I, aimless between the mountain and the sea, I who follow no one but myself, what am I doing among all these devotees, here where time has found its end?
Kareem, can I ask you to read one more poem and then we'll go to Roger? I want to leave a lot of time for Q&A.
Sure, no problem. Let's see, then I will read. I'll read one in Arabic and English if it's okay. It's not too long.
Perfect.
This one is from the same book and it's called I Always Knew. Kuntu a'rifu da'iman. I'll read the Arabic first. استيقظت فلم أجدها جاء لصوصا وأنا نائم وسرقوها كنت أعرف دائما كنت أنتظر هذا النهار انتظرته مرارا عند المنعطفات في الكوابيس ليس الأمر مروعا سرقوها كنت أعرف أن هذا سيحدث لكن ماذا سأصنع الآن بسمائها الزرقاء ببحرها وجبلها بنفسي وبكل ما تركه اللصوص وراء. I always knew. I woke up and she wasn't there. Thieves came while I was sleeping and carried her away. I knew it. I always knew. Often at the twists and nightmares, I'd waited for that day. There's no cause for alarm. They stole her, and I always knew it would happen. But what should I do now with her blue sky, with her mountains and sea, with myself and everything else the thieves left behind? Thank you.
Wow, that Arab language is really, really beautiful. Very, very difficult to pronounce, I think, if you're not from the area. Anyway, thank you very much. And we'll get to some Q&A after. And now, Roger, I want to just introduce you by saying that you're a poet in your own right. And that's always an interesting issue, that you translate and do your own poetry. And that your book, Haji, what was I going to say? The Puppet, won the 10th Gate Prize through the WordWorks. And you are you teach in the MFA program and literary translation, I should say, at Queens College, City University of New York. And I got to read this because one of the blurbs for Haji reads, a psychedelic romp through ancient Persian psyche, all the way through modern Iranian hellscapes via the American imagination. I think I might kill for a blurb like that. I like it a lot. And why don't you begin? And then after we can talk about languages, and I hope you'll read something in the original.
Let's begin. Thank you, Barbara, Henry, everyone at Café Muse. So good to read with Kareem again. As I think you'll see, we have more in common than just the region. Despite centuries of difference and language difference, there are political similarities between Hafez and what we just heard. And we got a shout out to the Persian Gardens in a poem. So I'm going to read one contemporary poet. I've kind of lost touch with this guy. He's an architect living in Shiraz, where my family's from, Haji Habari. He's also a musician, very postmodern, at the time, pretty punk. So this is just one poem from him. It came out in Poetry Magazine. There's one allusion. He mentions the 12th nightingale. In Shia Islam, the 12th Imam is going to come back like a kind of messiah. So, okay. Techno origami. The 3D printer worked overtime, sculpting lemon trees, complete with bees on budding flowers. The overheated machine filled the cardboard orchard with the scent of hot plastic. The 12th nightingale arrived like a prophet in a cloud of smoke, considering the same hand that pushed print remained destined to strike a single match and wave goodbye to paradise. So I always love that one. So now we go from the 21st century back to the 14th century with Hafez. No exaggeration to say this poet is like Shakespeare for England, maybe even more important to the nation. Not a lot is known of his background. Supposedly he was a baker early in life, and he was delivering bread to this, and saw this beautiful woman, and drew like a circle and kept a 40-day vigil in hopes of seeing her. And the angel Gabriel appeared when he was fasting and said, I'll give you any of your desires. And instead of asking for her, he asked to see the infinite. And that's all of Sufi mystic poetry is in that story, because the beloved in the material world is not just like the woman you write a blazon for in a sonnet in England. It's really a metaphor for God in the Sufi tradition. Emerson was obsessed with Hafez. He said of this poet, he sees too far, he sees throughout, such is the only man I wish to see and to be. That's what Emerson said. And he's best known for his ghazal in this Persian form. Some called it the Persian sonnet, so not a sonnet. It's in contained couplets, and you'll hear the rhyme and the repeated phrase. So each couplet could be its own poem, yet it's linked by sound. And that also is a very Sufi mystic, like it seems like things aren't connected, but we're all connected. And the last thing I'll say about translating these, one of the other great ancient masters said in Persian poetry, the poem is in the rhyme. And you just can't explain a pun by Hafez. Like one pun will have 7 different meanings. It'll mean something sensual, something divine, all at the same time. What can you do? You do the best. I try to preserve the rhyme. So the first ghazal, I'll read. Hafez took his pen name for somebody who's memorized the Quran. He really knew, very religious. And yet what makes him feel contemporary is like, and you know why Emerson liked him, he really hated religious hypocrisy, like pious preaching. He would be like Jesus with, the prostitutes outside the mosque, not with the people pretending to be spiritual. Okay. I long to open letters from my heart. Such painful verse in letters of my heart. My crass desires the secret of my sin. It's safely sealed in letters from my heart. I read your body like a holy book. Libraries ban the letters from my heart. With golden ink and dots of pearl I write, the skies bejeweled with letters from my heart. These fragrant flowers in the morning breeze spread in this field of letters from my heart. The tip of your eyelash used as a pen, your tempting gaze writes letters to my heart. How can Hafez write illicit couplets? The scholars censor letters from my heart. And there's always often this convention, the last line, last couplet, the poet mentions himself, herself, often in a pseudonym, as Hafez had a pseudonym, and the illicit, the sensual in his verse, he often juxtaposes that with the spiritual. Sometimes I think we think postmodernism kind of invented putting the high with the low, creating verse out of other verse, like intertextuality. Hafez is a master of doing that in the 14th century. So another one on the theme of desire. I find myself lost somewhere in your room. Despite the dark, I still stare in your room. Don't ask blind prophets for their great wisdom. All hidden truths are laid bare in your room. The rose and nightingale become a song. I dance to sounds of nature in your room. Lovesick, I know that you're my medicine. I've overdosed on your care in your room. Try sweeping me like dust outside your door. I'll find a way through air back in your room. Your currency of love is safe with me. I guard such sacred treasure in your room. The jockey's spirit tames the wildest horse. He gallops with great power in your room. Why should I ever think of going home? The sky has juggled its stars in your room. Hafez's poetry is your sweet voice. He just records what he hears in your room. And I will skip ahead to a doozy of one. Oh yes, so there's such a value of sharing our work like this, preparing for this reading as poets and translators. You know that if you're either one of those, because it makes you kind of meta reflect on your choices. Why am I picking this one out of all of them? What were the struggles I had? And then, you can even if you did something a while ago, like I dusted these off and I'm like, yeah, maybe I'm going to change this, So I think there's a great value in doing something like this. This one I chose to read because it really highlights his wordplay. The rhetoric of spirituality in all traditions seems to be paradoxical. It kind of doubles back on itself, a lot of negation. Hafez does that a lot, and I kind of captured something of that here. And the puns. The great Peter Cole translates Hebrew. He told me once we were reading together that, we were both bemoaning the loss of great puns in translation. And he said, I just let them go away. If they have to be lost, they're lost. And then just look for opportunities to bring something back somewhere else, to retrieve a different pun. The repeated end for this poem is not the same in the original Persian, but I think it works. And also it's thankfully monosyllabic, as a lot of rhymes in Persian are monosyllabic. So here we go. Paradoxically spiritual, essential Hafez, quintessential Hafez. Maybe I'll read this one and then show a couple of images and be done. Locks of her hair bind him. Untie the knot. Within this story's tension lies the knot. With best of friends, all things are possible. Together, this night, let's challenge the not. Those who transcended reason understand. The language music plays transcribes the not. The lovers dwell in possibility. Faith in desire can't help deny the not. She tempts you with rejection of desire. Her beautiful veil always hides the knot. The elder rightly told the younger crowd, don't think the sober one is wise. He's not. For everyone who suffers without love, tell them stop sobbing and decry the knot. Give Hafez something for his suffering. Pray he and his beloved tie the knot. Oh, and maybe I'll read one more and then I show two pictures and I'm done. So this one was the very first Hafez poem I ever.
Don't forget to read in the original language.
Oh yeah, I don't have that in front of me right now, but I will. I can maybe make an adjustment. This one, I was visiting Iran when my older son, who's now starting college, was 2. I can't believe it was so long ago. And this is the very first Hafez poem I translated with my father's cousin. We were kind of like talking Hafez, reading Hafez. So a hopo is a symbol of a Persian bird. In Attar's famous Conference of the Birds, you'll hear that. If we don't know the story of that poem, it's a book. The Simorg, it's 30 birds go in search for kind of this enlightenment, this uber bird that's gonna like show them Sufi enlightenment. And they realize on the course of this journey that they, as the 30 birds, were the very big bird they were looking for all along. So C in Persian is 30, morg is bird, so 30 birds. So it's kind of this meta, okay. So the very first poem I translated, "Oh wise hopo, to Sheba I send you. Please understand where it is I send you. A broken winged bird in a hurricane still finds the eye. This calm I will send you. My heart knows enough science to perceive existence of the true love I send you. This caravan of prayers in the desert, this pilgrimage of spirit I send you. To keep you holding on to me for life, my tortured soul as hostage I send you. My heart's companion hidden from my sight, she asked, did you send me or I send you? God is a mirror for the lover's face. Find yourself in these letters I send you. So that musicians play with my desire, I've written words to each note I send you. It's nothing to suffer. Gabriel says, behold, death's panacea I send you. Hafez, Hafez, we're all calling your name. Get dressed. These new clothes and a fast horse I send you. And I wanted to briefly end, I'm under time, in 2 minutes to share how relevant Hafez remains today in calling out hypocrites. Certainly would work well in American politics as well as Iranian politics. So on Instagram, during these last rounds of horrific protests, they seem to keep coming and the regime keeps clamping down, I juxtapose these images with my own interventions with Hafez's translations. So if I can share my screen, which I think I can, let's see if this works. And if it doesn't, we'll call it a day. Let's see. Can we see this? Yes. We can see it? Great. So a couple of them. This actually is Hafez's own words. Okay, so this is the current Ayatollah Khamenei in the foreground with the big man, Khomeini, who, founder of the revolution. And these are actually Hafez's own words. In front of masses, mullahs do good deeds, but they act differently behind the scenes. So he's hanging these young men. The regime is hanging these young men. That's a juxtaposition. That's my translation. I put these on Instagram. And then this one is I intervened in. You have, again, Khamenei on one side, split image I put together. And this is Masa, the woman that's almost the year anniversary, who was beaten to death for not covering her hair. So the original Hafez lines are, you really think you'll stop fated heartbreak? The justice of God's sentencing's on you. And then I intervene as poet interventionist. You really think you'll stop the protests? Khamenei, the justice of God's sentencing's on you. And I know that seems like maybe, wow, what an adulteration, but really, Hafez was calling out these ayatollahs for, not this exactly, but oppressive strictures back in the 14th century. And I think this is the last one. It became part of the protest to walk behind a mullah and rip his, really rip the head covering off, right? So the turban. So originally it's take off your mask and radiate the truth. The world will see you then as the wisest. And this is quite a change. Rip off his turban to reveal the truth. The world now sees mullahs as hypocrites. So that was kind of the, and I did get some Iranians in the diaspora, another, posted in Iran, although there's a lot of controls there, but it was a helpful kind of like beginning punk dialogue of sorts. So I'll end it there. I'll stop my share and I'll stop reading.
I don't know why those ghazals are so funny, but many of them are.
They really are. Yeah, they still
The
have
repetition and the clever use of knots, for instance. So thank you very much. I wanted to ask why you chose to translate someone as stone cold dead, and can't say how marvelous your translations are.
I know Kareem has the fresher material, and not only that, Barbara, and woe to other translators taking on, there's so many versions of Hafez, right? Emerson, through German sources was translating him. The great Dick Davis, boy, I mean, what am I going to do, right? But I never thought I'd try to actively publish them. I did them kind of as exercises for me. But if you're a poet or, really interested in poetry, he's such a master that you just keep gravitating back to him. And I had my second collection of my own poetry in English were ghazals with Ohio University Press. And in the weirdest way I could have never thought, Barbara, just by doing these little side exercises with Hafez, he actually taught me how to write in the form in English. It's like that with influence for the poets in the crowd, right? Like you want to be somebody and of course you just can't be them, right? So, but you try and you're like, oh, and then something of your voice comes there. And I guess he ended up being a kind of teacher for me and very humbling. Yeah. But the good thing in the public domain, he's not here to hate on my choices, I guess. Nobody can do anything to me. I can just translate.
Kareem, is Mutanabi like that, if I'm pronouncing his name right?
Like that in what sense?
Well, like very revered, Shakespearean.
Yes, he's probably the best known of all the poets, but he does so many puns and wordplay and different things. The poetry is so reliant on that there's, as far as I know, there's yet to be a very comprehensible translation into English, and I certainly think it's probably the hardest thing anyone could.
Right, puns are impossible. Something else for you, Kareem. You mentioned that no, I forget.
There's
Oh,
one.
that in England, same for you, Roger. English is a very rich language, probably has more words than many of the other languages of the world. Usually in English, one word can mean one thing. It can mean many things, but it's usually one per one. But Kareem, apparently in Arabic, one word can mean 10 million things. So how do you decide which meaning to have for your poems, for the translations, I should say?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me just say one quick thing before I forget, because I wanted to tie it back to what Roger was saying. I just wanted to mention that Najwan Darwish has at least 5 or 6 poems that are about Hafiz, or where Hafiz makes appearances. And I think there may be more than that. There's two just in this. There's 2 that I'm working on now, and I can think of at least 2 more. So, and it was interesting to see the juxtapositions, the modern interventions that you were doing at the end, Roger, because in many of Hafiz's poems, he really does appear like a revolutionary figure. Najwan Darwish is interested in the mystical, but Hafiz kind of appears more as this almost a grumpy old man telling the foolish youth, like confronting the foolish youth with his sort of age-old wisdom. And so it was, I appreciated the Hafiz that kind of came out, that Hafiz that I felt came out very much in your translations. Whereas in other ones, you kind of, a lot of that, I feel, other translations, a lot of that's lost, and only the mystical is emphasized, if that makes sense. And I think, we saw from what you were doing that there's much more than just that. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that because I was going to read one of the poems, but then we ran out of time. But to answer your question, Barbara, a million meanings is obviously an exaggeration, but there are definitely, among all the major modern languages, English has the most words, and the sort of, the classic example that when I was studying in college, people would always compare Shakespeare with the French poet writing at the same time, Racine. And Shakespeare had an active lexicon in his plays of about 16,000 words, whereas Racine had about 4,000 writing in French. And now Racine did that kind of consciously, but that's also kind of apt comparison between the languages. With Arabic, the words do have a much broader semantic range in general. And you mentioned al-Mutanabi, he plays with that probably more than anyone else. And so it does pose difficulties. There's even a category of nouns that English linguists now call contronyms, but it's a word that means itself and also has a meaning that is opposite to that. So in English, one of the few that we have is like cleave in the biblical sense, to tear 2 things apart, or it can mean to bring them together, though that meaning has disappeared a little bit in modern usage. Arabic has a whole bunch of those. And I will say it creates a lot of challenges. There's a lot of picking and choosing. With Najwan Darwish's poetry, he's less interested in the wordplay, I would say. So you're getting a bit less of that. There was one modern poet, Adonis is his pen name, and he's constantly mentioned for the Nobel Prize. I co-translated a book by him that has a lot of that, where the words have multiple meanings. Often one of the meanings is more political, one of them has a Sufi resonance. Even, I can think of right at the beginning of that book, there's a line, something like, very simple one, but it was, and yesterday, I think it was, and yesterday I displaced the sea. But the word for sea in Arabic, al-bahr, like the sea as in a body of water, is also the word for poetic meter. And the book was kind of revolutionizing poetic meter. And that whole text where that appears, there were a whole bunch of words that had basically, you could read them in their most obvious meaning, in that case would be the sea. And there was another meaning that was kind of meta-poetic or dealing more with language. And some of that stuff is just lost. And I think I like what Roger said about Peter Cole, that quotation. You try to kind of get some of it back elsewhere if it's lost. And it's the trick with poems too. You can only gloss or explain so much in a poem. You don't have the same space. Like when I'm translating a novel, I feel like I have a lot of space to kind of explain something if I have to, right?
Want to
With-
get into some of our viewers' questions, because some of them are really, well, all of them are fabulous. One is from Maritza. Well, we could go on about this. What are the poet's greatest challenge when translating poetry? I think you said it actually, or I've heard it before, to make it sound as though it was originally written in English. Of course, I answered that, but feel free.
Roger, you were going to say something?
No, for me, it's the, I guess it depends on what I'd be translating, but for Hafez, like for sure, it's like this, the puns and also the I think the musicality, because Persian, like so many languages, it just so naturally rhymes and sings. At Hafez's tomb on a loudspeaker, they have his poems in song. Rumi set so much to music, and there's something that just sounds so stilted in English. And even the puns, you know, like what's a good pun in English? They're either like little kids, you know, to make your kid laugh, right? Or like Alexander Pope, you know, like quippy, you know, like that. You know, you don't want to be that guy, you know, that puns. So I weirdly, and I think we do this in translation work a lot, like you find your kind of answer outside of even both traditions you're working in, or, you know, you get interdisciplinary, I guess. And I kind of like have always been a fan of the seminal hip hop, you know, the early like Biggie kind of stuff. And, you know, Notorious B.I.G. can layer like 5 rhymes on top of each other, and they're driving the song and they're fresh. And I don't see poets doing that so well, like on the page. And then I came to find there's an article Lawrence Venuti has in some translation reader about also using hip hop for rhymes. But really, the long story short of it is trying to capture the song in English words, where it actually, and I know with Coleman Barks sets it to music. I've done some of that to kind of have an atmosphere of music, if that makes sense.
I love the, combining hip hop with it, because I've always thought hip hop was just genius, especially if they really are, ad-libbing as they're up there. That's pretty phenomenal. But finding the rhymes and the rhythm, it's a different rhythm, but still. Kareem, I have one for you, kind of complicated, from Susanna Case. I noticed that you moved your body, your head, differently when reading Arabic when you were reading English. And I wondered if you had thoughts about the relationship between language and the way our body responds to language. How's that?
I don't know if I have an answer for that one. I wasn't aware I was doing that, so I'll have to.
By the way, noticeably.
Yeah, well, there is a different musicality with the Arabic, so that's probably part of it. So can you say the question part again? I missed the relationship of the body to.
Have you had thoughts about the relationship between language and the way our bodies respond to language?
I'm not sure. I will say one exercise I do, and this is a half answer to that question, but a short one. One exercise I do when translating is at the very end, particularly with poetry, I don't usually do it with prose, is I try to read the translation and sort of suspend the faculty of the brain that processes meaning. In other words, focus exclusively on the sound and forget everything else. And there's a few like amazing translators where if you do this with their work, like Seamus Heaney reading his translation of Beowulf, or I love almost anything by Robert Fagles if we're going into the classics. So that, because then it hits your body a certain way. You're really just focused on the musicality. And I find sometimes that can help me get through some difficulties I'm having sometimes with the texts. It's a half answer, but that's the best I can.
It's a good answer, because it's like nursery rhymes and things like that when you're young, how they, affect your mindset or whatever. I'm wondering if I'm missing any. Am I? Karen, do you see any other questions? Because if not, I'm going to ask you, Kareem.
There are several more questions further down. Karen had a question, in fact, for Roger.
Oh, yeah. Roger, I wanted to know what the name of that first poet that you read. You didn't tell us who he or she was. You're mute.
Yes, his last name is Havari, like Khaviri. I met him. He was younger than me. I mean, he's still younger than me, but I guess, yeah, he was mid-20s when I met him. I imagine he's, and never put out a book. It just, they're not, I don't want to generalize, but like my generation or younger generation of poets, they're not as like, they're not like our MFA students in America. They're not all like, I gotta get the book, it's, they don't, and publishing is different. But it's a really, really great poet, and really interested in the kind of edgy, Borges recently was brought to Iran, and we were talking through translation. He actually has functional English, so he collaborated with me on a good handful of his poems. I always had this vision, like he'd put out a collection or I would help him, and it didn't happen, but I love that kind of stuff that he writes.
I think that the question of translating poetry as sound, because both you, Roger, and Kareem talked about this, is a challenge for our time, that in order to get the the musicality of language poetry, you can hear it in the foreign language, but if you have no recognition of any of the words, it tends to go right over the head, and you lose it. But if you can just do something with the sound of that language, even if it's not the same words, it's a very meaningful thing. So I think that both of you should be commended for stepping into this very difficult area of translation. I commend you both.
And Barbara, Robbie Nestor asked 2
I'm
questions.
seeing 2, and one of them is, how often do you use footnotes? Do you mean in a glossary or at the bottom of the page, or both? You mean when with the translation, so to kind of explicate the text? That's to really both of you.
I mean, it depends on the book. I don't like footnotes like at the bottom of the page, because I think it distracts. I think what's kind of more common in publishing in the US anyway nowadays is to have notes at the back.
Right.
So people can look. Now, what I will do sometimes, a lot of Najwan Darwish's poems are predicated or based on some very famous snippet of classical Arabic poetry, whether it's 1,000 years old or 1,500 years old. And he can kind of take for granted that the Arabic reader will know what he's talking about, right? In English, we can't. So often there's many poems where I've added epigraphs, which is just the minimum amount of that classical poem to make his text comprehensible, if that makes sense, right? So if he's basing a text on one line from something, I'll put that poem in as an epigraph or that snippet. And so that's an addition that I will make sometimes, because I think otherwise the poem doesn't make any sense in English, right? That cultural context is not there. So I do think about translating context, but it's not always in footnotes. And again, it depends on the publisher too. But pretty much every book of poetry I've translated has had some notes.
Right.
The Anonymous that I mentioned had a lot, because it was a very seminal collection. Najwan Darwish has a bit less, but his next book will be coming out with hopefully in about a year and a half, there'll be a selected poems with Yale's Margellos World Republic of Letters. And that's a university press, so they're more open to a little bit more slightly fuller note section in the back. And so I might do that in this case.
Just to say really quickly that in Hebrew poetry, of course, you have the same thing using biblical references, which most people there will understand, but for a wider often will go over their heads. So that's another reason for footnotes or writing into the text, you
Mhm.
know, using a word that's kind of not expected, but similar to what the biblical reference is. Roger, I don't mean to cut you off. So what are your comments on?
No, I would say the same as what Kareem said. And I was thinking too, my graduate translation students, they really have strong feelings, surprisingly strong feelings about footnotes. Like some are like, it's all footnotes, and then others are like, honestly, like the reader should do the work, and I don't know if it's a generational thing or what. And also as a translator editor, Barbara, like if you're taking on a book, I mean, do you have strong feelings either way, or,
Well, I don't love a footnote.
you don't
I-
love a footnote? But like Kareem said, not at the bottom of the page,
No,
especially.
no,
Yeah.
that's, yeah,
Oh,
a glossary or notes.
I do still, even in languages, most languages that I don't know, I still a sucker for the original on the other side of the page. I just, I just
Bilingual.
find that very interesting,
Right,
And I do think also now with the internet, there's a lot fewer notes are needed, right? Because so much stuff can be looked up very quickly, a place name or something like that. But even then, sometimes a note can be useful with if there's some specific context.
Well, Hafez, like he definitely uses the Quran and he doesn't quote, like now I'm using but you would have to know it. You would have to know the Quran and grow up in the culture. But
Right.
I was thinking about it as on the Americanist scholar side of me, like it's not that different from my like undergrads reading 19th century American literature. They don't know that the Bible is like filled with it, and you just want to say like, you don't get that, they're actually doing this exactly, and there's no footnote. Like one of
Right.
those.
I'm afraid we kind of have to close shop. Any last minute thoughts? I loved it. This was terrific.
This has been great, really.
This
And
has
the
been
images,
great.
the music in the beginning. Thank you so much for coming out.
Yeah. And I appreciate you two guys.
And thanks again, Barbara Goldberg. And thanks to our poets, Kareem James Abu Zaid and Roger Sedarit.
Close enough.
Thanks also for our introductory segment with Michael Davis, photos by Dan Marino and assembled by Henry Crawford. Finally, thanks to the entire Café Muse team. That includes me, Luther Jett, along with Ellen Cole, Henry Crawford, Maj Dagama, Renee Garrity, Claire McGough, and of course, WordWorks founder and leader, Karen Alenier. Please join us next month, Monday, September 11th. The next Café Muse will feature Iman Quota and Anne Harding Woodworth. Have a wonderful evening and stay empowered.
Oh.